Hello 474 students, and welcome to Chapter 3. In this chapter we'll be discussing ethical theories which will be used to help to compare and weigh alternatives when making ethical decisions. So when we're looking at making ethical decisions, it's helpful to have some theories and traditions to help guide our decisions. We can break this guidance down into three general categories. Guidance which focuses on consequences, guidance which focuses on principles, and guidance which focuses on personal character. All right? And these ethical theories help to provide a systematic answer to the fundamental question we discussed in Chapter 1. How should we live our lives? It is important to consider the fact that it is difficult to say what is right and wrong. So the perspective of ethical relativism holds that ethical values are relative to particular people, cultures, or times. So, for example, what is considered to be unethical in today's day and age might 100 or 200 or even 1,000 years ago have been considered to be quite ethical and appropriate. And it is the same when we're talking about different cultures today. What might be perceived to be unethical in one culture might be ethical in the other. So we do have to acknowledge that we can have ethical disagreements between people or cultures, and the ethical relativist perspective would suggest that there's no way to resolve that dispute. However, we will talk about some ethical theories which we can apply to some extent in most cultures, at least in today's modern era. The first is the utilitarian perspective. This is the perspective that focuses on consequences. So we're focused on outcomes here. All right? And the utilitarian perspective says that we should act in ways that produce better consequences than other alternatives. Okay? And we're talking about consequences. We're talking about those that promote outcomes such as the happiness or health of our stakeholders in an organizational context. So what decisions can we make that promote the greatest good or maximizes the greatest good for our internal stakeholders as well as our external stakeholders. All right, so when you hear about utilitarianism, you should think about phrases such as maximizing the overall good or the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, there are, of course, challenges to all the ethical theories. So, for example, in the context of a utilitarian decision, we might say that we have challenges in terms of counting, measuring, comparing, and actually quantifying the alternatives. So we might say, okay, we want to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of our stakeholders, both internal and external, but how do we know for certain if we can't see the actual outcome? How do we know that we've actually made the decision that is going to successfully promote the greater good for all these individuals? I'd also add the utilitarian perspective is also sort of associated with the phrase, the ends justify the means, where we're comfortable doing a variety of different things to get to an outcome that promotes the greatest good for the greater number of people. So from a utilitarian perspective, you might even say that it is ethical to lie. All right. So in this instance, we might say lying is appropriate as long as it's accomplishing a positive good for a large number of people. Another perspective which we'll discuss throughout this course has to do with the deontological perspective. And so the deontological perspective is focused on following legal rules which are derived from various institutions, as well as professional rules that are more occupational specific. So the deontological perspective essentially tells us that there are rules that we ought to follow even if doing so prevents good consequences from happening, or even if it results in some bad consequences. So in this instance, we're not focused on the perspective of the ends justify the means, we're focused on the means. We might say that it is unfortunate sometimes if there are negative consequences, but we do have to pay attention to how we reach those consequences, and we have to follow the rules even if that means bad things are going to happen. One of the most famous philosophers associated with the deontological perspective is Immanuel Kant, and you'll see the book will refer to a Kantian perspective on numerous instances. Kant discussed the importance of basic human rights, such as respecting the dignity of each individual human being. And there are a lot of basic rights which we can discuss that someone might be entitled to in an organizational context, both internal and external stakeholders again. Okay, so the Kantian perspective would suggest that we have fundamental human rights. This could include things supported by our Constitution, such as free speech or the right to bear arms. And we might say that humans have a fundamental right to autonomy and self-rule. And we'll bring this up numerous times in an organizational context and an HR context. What rights do employees have to autonomy in terms of managing technology in the workplace? What right do employees or our customers have to managing information and data about themselves that we might collect as a business? So there are several examples about moral and legal rights which we might consider in a deontological perspective. So we might consider legal rights, so these would be rights granted to employees on the basis of legislation or judicial rulings, and an example of this would of course be minimum wage. We might focus on employee rights that pertain to things that have been decided upon in an employment contract, such as someone's pay or someone's vacation days or someone's benefits and so forth. Someone's sort of the number of hours that someone's scheduled to work in a particular week. And we might also say that we just have fundamental rights that we're entitled to, rights owed to us as human beings in a workplace. So for example, we have a fundamental right to work in a place that's free of sexual harassment. So we might say that that is something that's been legally guaranteed, but we might also say from an ethical perspective that we have that right regardless of what the law says. Of course, similar to the utilitarian perspective, there are challenges to applying the deontological perspective. So to begin, we might say that there is no guarantee, there is no agreement about what the rules actually are. So we may have instances where we might disagree about what the law says. We might have disagreements about what an employment policy or contract says. This could be for a variety of different reasons. There might be gray area in which we can see clearly what the rule states, but we're not certain about whether or not this is actually the case. You can imagine watching your favorite sports team play. The referee blows a whistle calling a foul on them or throws a flag in football, and you're frustrated and you think that the referee is misinterpreting the law. Well, the rule or law is clearly stated, but there's some disagreement about whether or not the referee is interpreting it correctly. Then, of course, we have the possibility that someone doesn't agree that that is an appropriate rule or law in the first place. We may also just have simple practical problems where we have agreement on what a rule or law might say, but we actually have challenges in implementing that law. So, for example, we might say that everyone has a fundamental right to free speech. That's something that is pretty much universally agreed upon. But there are, of course, caveats to this. We might say it would be dangerous to stand in a crowded movie theater and shout, "Fire, fire." So in that instance, we might say, well, yes, we agree that fundamentally we all have a right to free speech, but in an instance where you're going to potentially cause some public harm, we might not want to have someone standing in a crowded theater shouting, "Fire, fire." So you can see here we already have an exception to the rule. And we can continue down this continuum where we might have some other instances where we might say, yes, someone has a right to free speech, but potentially that crosses the line, and there may be disagreement about where we might say a line has been crossed. And finally, we have our virtue-based ethics. Okay, so this pertains to making decisions based on integrity and character. So unlike the deontological or the utilitarian perspective, which focuses on providing some rules to be followed or a focus on outcomes, the virtue ethics perspective shifts the focus to the individual and says, what sort of character guidance can we provide you with based on virtues? So for example, instead of saying what should a person do, we might say who should that person be? Who are they? What sort of values should they use to guide their behaviors? So some examples of some very famous virtues that have survived over time, we might say there have been virtues related to courage, moderation, wisdom, justice. The virtue pertaining to moderation has been a very popular one, dating from the time of ancient Greeks to medieval times, in which we might say there's a golden mean between two extremes that we might try to balance. And the example I have provided here includes a brave person finds the balance between too little courage, which is cowardice, and too much courage, which would be reckless and foolhardy. Okay, so we can use these theories, these guidelines for making ethical decisions in a work context, and we would specifically apply it to the decision-making process from Chapter 2, in which we're comparing and weighing alternatives that affect various primary and secondary stakeholders. So we might look at the consequences of our alternatives. How are they benefiting or harming stakeholders in terms of outcomes? We might say, what are our duties, rights, or principles? What are the laws say? What are our professional duties? How are people being treated? Are their fundamental rights being respected? And we might also say, what implications do our decisions have for personal integrity and character? So what type of person am I becoming through this decision? Am I comfortable with that? What are my own principles and purposes? And can I live with the public disclosure of this decision? Alright, so this served as an introduction to the Chapter 3 content, and you may now proceed with the remaining content for Module 3.